Hello, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us. My name is Betsy Agar. I am the Buildings Policy Director at Efficiency Canada, and we are housed at Carleton University in Ottawa. I want to acknowledge that Carleton is a campus that's on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. I have the privilege of hosting this session from where I live and work on the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish peoples, which is also known as North Vancouver. Just quickly, if you don't know, Efficiency Canada is a national voice for energy efficiency economy. We envision a future where Canada uses energy efficiency to its fullest potential. To fulfill our mandate, our small, mighty team researches and identifies effective energy efficiency policies. We communicate the benefits and significance of investing in energy efficiency, and we work to mobilize the energy efficiency community for collective action and change. We work on buildings, energy poverty, improving appliance and equipment standards, transforming business models, preparing a diverse and skilled workforce, and advancing utility demand-side management. And all that is in the name of energy efficiency, which fits beautifully with today's topic. But just a reminder, we are recording this session. It will be available later for you to share or go back to if there's something you wanted to catch again. The speakers will take about 20, 25 minutes to present their materials, and we'll follow up with a Q&A at the end. We do like you to use the Zoom question box so that people can upvote your questions, but the chat box is also open for other discussions, for sharing materials. And then, as always, you can reach out to our speakers directly. I'm not going to do a big, long introduction, but I'm excited to host Bryn Neely, the Executive Director, Sustainable Buildings Canada, and then Yazan Zamel, who's President of the Sustainable Engineers Association and the primary researcher on this work. With that, I'm excited to just get us started on from policy to practice, enabling decarbonization in Canada's condo sector. Bryn, are you kicking us off, or is Yazan?
Yeah, I'll dive in. Betsy, thanks so much for that introduction. And thank you to Efficiency Canada for including us in this really exciting venue that you guys provide for valuable discussion. We're thrilled to be here. So, Yazan, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. Leading Sustainable Buildings Canada, you may or may not have heard of us. We have been around for a little over 20 years as a not-for-profit who champions sustainable buildings. We do this primarily through providing educational workshops and through providing opportunities to work with researchers to scratch the itch on critical questions to higher performance buildings, as well as buildings that have net positive outcomes, including the human experience within our built environment. We've held over 800 workshops to date that are really driven through the integrated design process, working directly with the development community, as well as other stakeholders who are making these really important decisions in both new and existing buildings. Through the vision of being a catalyst for positive transformation to a sustainable built environment, our main objective as a nonprofit is to connect communities of learners, practitioners, and leaders, and to create platforms in order to share best practices, discuss novel approaches, and to build holistic solutions. We really believe that by starting as early in the process with having these things in mind, that there doesn't really have to be that cost consequence of a high performance, energy efficient building. You're really front loading the best thinking and decision making and the costs associated with that so that everything else along the way can be clicked in effectively and efficiently to little to no additional cost. And that's really important to us, especially in this moment in time where the affordability of housing is such a major discussion in the public realm right now. And it's essential that we're keeping in mind the affordability, not only of the upfront price, which is of course very important, but also how affordable it is to live in and maintain and operate these buildings that we're creating, or the vast majority of our buildings are existing, and how we can make those function more affordably. I'll pass it shortly over to Yazan, but I just wanted to give a bit of a background about why it is that we sought him out to help us do this research in the first place. In 2024, Sustainable Buildings Canada recognized a significant and important gap in the decision-making process of our existing building stock, and that's really within the condominium sector. We know that there are critical decision makers within that form of building that may not have the tools or may not have experience specifically in energy performance, and yet are tasked with making really important decisions that are going to have long-term impacts on not only their own housing costs and climate implications for the rest of us as well. The sheer number of condominiums across Canada shows the importance of a spotlight on this group. So, what Sustainable Buildings Canada did was host a series of workshops called Better Condos Boot Camp. And participants in these workshops included condominium unit owners, board members, as well as the professionals charged with the maintenance and operations of the building, and to work together to learn collectively about the impacts to themselves from climate change or potential and future impacts, as well as how they can be influencing climate change through the decisions that they're making, to walk them through some of the considerations and to make sure that they are working collectively as a team with full information in order to prioritize their investments in their homes. And we saw really great and powerful outcomes in terms of the attitudes and the knowledge. We saw amazing collaboration between these three different groups within their own buildings, collectively deciding that it's important to make investments that are going to save them in the long term and reduce their risks as a building. One of the things we learned through that was that one of the barriers and challenges was in how regulatory documents were being interpreted and used to make the decisions of improvements to their building. And we wanted to dig into that even further. So that is how we ended up seeking out Yazan and working with him to do this really incredible research. I'll pass it over to you from here, Yazan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Bren, for that great introduction. Also, thank you so much, Betsy and Lindsay, and to the entire Efficiency Canada team for introducing us to this great program and for also hosting us here. So, hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to present my research on unlocking deep energy retrofits in Canada's condos, where in this research, I explored the mechanisms that can turn legal barriers into national enablers in order for us to decarbonize multi-unit residential buildings or MERBs, as you will see me reference them throughout the presentation today across Canada's urban landscape. So before I begin, I want to first let you know more about me, who's Yazan. So I'm Yazan. I'm a Master's of Applied Science candidate at the University of Toronto, where I specialize in building energy and indoor environments. And my background before my master's degree was in energy systems engineering. And I'm also currently serving as the president of Sustainable Engineers Association, where we focus on providing career training, professional development opportunities for youth in the energy sector. So when it comes to this research project itself that I worked with SBC on, as you can see, I have a very technical background in energy systems, and my current research project is in terms of evaluating post-occupancy multi-unit residential buildings or MERBs in terms of post-retrofit, how their energy consumption is versus pre-retrofit and doing energy assessments for performance gaps. So I was really doing on so much work that has to do with quantifying energy retrofits and their impacts on the energy assessments, on indoor air quality and other components. But I felt there was definitely something lacking when it came to the policy framework. This is where my research with Sustainable Buildings Canada come into place, where I started doing more research on the policy framework understanding and to help me understand really why are retrofits limited. What are the barriers to retrofits? What can actually enable retrofits? And that brings me to my research project that was also supported by the Committee on Environment, Climate Change and Sustainability at the University of Toronto, as they were able to support me to start off the research with Sustainable Buildings Canada. So let's start about the project. The project focuses on the legal and policy barriers and enablers to deep energy retrofits in condos. So while the study was initially focused on Ontario, because this is where the challenge definition came in, this is where terminology and actually understanding the barriers started. The focus is also on how these lessons can actually unlock retrofit activity nationwide. So how can we actually scale this, not just in Ontario, but rather across Canada? And this is exactly where my project focused on analyzing the condo laws across Canada and also analyzing the impact of those laws and regulations in terms of the ability to complete deep energy retrofits in existing buildings. So you might ask why deep energy retrofits matter to Canada. So Canada's built environment is responsible for nearly 18% of the national greenhouse gas emissions. And condos certainly represent one of the fastest growing housing types. So in Ontario alone, according to the CMHC report, over 1.7 million people live in condos, but also similar concentrations exist in BC, Alberta, and Quebec. And deep energy retrofits, which would target the building envelope, the HVAC systems, the lighting system, can actually cut emissions between 31% to 59% per building. And while savings can be in terms of 30 to 50% in operational costs, which is a significant amount. Yet, unfortunately, Canada's retrofit rates is only at around 1% per year, which is below the 2.5% that we need by 2030 to stay on track for net zero. And also more fundamentally is that the condos sector actually represent the critical factors in Canada's climate action strategy, with millions of residents, as they have noted, living in multifamily buildings. Unlocking deep energy retrofits in this sector can certainly accelerate our pathways towards decarbonization while also driving substantial cost savings in those communities. So let's talk more at the research overview in terms of the methodology and the question that have emerged. So the project combined a legal analysis of the Condos Act in Ontario with a comparative review of other provinces, including BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Atlantic provinces. And I also conducted expert interviews with lawyers, engineers, building managers, building designers to really understand the role of the policies and the regulation frameworks in those real projects. And the goal certainly was not just to identify what the challenge is, but rather the goal was to extract those best practices and how they can actually be scaled across Canada. And this led to the central question to understand how can the policy and the governance structures and the legal frameworks actually accelerate the national decarbonization efforts in the condo sector. So as seen in the question, this research reveals both the barriers, but also the promising opportunities that we can have for transforming Canada's MERPs into a model of energy efficiency, but also achieving climate resilience. As I have noted, first I'll start with Ontario. So we're having a more focused view, and then we'll take a more helicopter view to look at throughout Canada at best practices. So as I have noted, we start off my research in Ontario. So Ontario's Condos Act, there is an intentional structure in terms of the different clauses and the governance structure there, but there is some barriers for sure in terms of progress. So specifically, one of sections that was brought to my attention was Section 97 of the Act, which divides the projects into two key definitions: repairs and improvements. So something very important is that there is a huge distinction between these two, which is really fundamental when it comes to understanding what repair and maintenance is defined. Repair and maintenance is defined as replacing or restoring existing components to substantially the same condition as originally constructed, which we call as like. And certainly this means that if there are any repairs or maintenance, the expectation that's going to be the same condition as originally constructed for you to use the reserve funds for. Now, significant changes to the common property, especially those with financial consequences, would actually require consent from the building ownership. And this is where the barrier comes in, because there are certain thresholds that are developed according to the estimated cost of the work as a proportion of the corporation's annual budget. The problem is that any projects that cost over 10% of the annual budget requires a 2/3 approvals from all the owners, not just those attending the annual general meeting. But the other barrier is that we actually have low attendance at those annual general meetings, which is only around 30 to 40%. So even if everyone is attending those meetings and everyone's supporting a retrofit, it can still fail, unfortunately, just because of those requirements. So definitely we can see here that limitations in terms of the retrofits can certainly come in due to those barriers in terms of the requirements for the retrofits. So here is also a more detailed analysis to help us understand the requirements for the common elements change, the one I spoke just earlier. So if it is less than 1% of the annual budget, so if the cost of the changes are less than 1% of the annual budget, and assuming this is going to be an improvement, not just simply a repair or maintenance, no notice is required to the owners. The board may proceed with the change. There's not going to be a voting requirement. However, if the cost is between 1 to 10%, there will be a written notice that should be provided to the owners, as well as there's going to be a 30-day requisition period. And then a meeting will be conducted if there is over 15% requisition. Now, in terms of the voting structure for that, the majority of owners attending the meeting may object or may agree. And based on that, the final decision will be made. Just kindly note that for here, it is based on the number of people or the number of owners attending the meeting. You're not looking at the cumulative ownership. For the last component, which I have mentioned, in cases where the estimated costs are more than 10% of the annual budget, this requires approval from 2/3 or 66.7% of all unit owners, not just those attendees, which is a threshold, unfortunately, that is rarely met in large buildings, especially in Ontario, due to the low meeting participation. So another limitation that comes to discussion in addition to the voting process is their reserve fund limitations. So in section 93, there is a requirement for corporations to maintain a reserve fund exclusively for major repairs and replacements of common elements. So having an updated reserve fund study, what is known as enhanced reserve fund, is to reflect those inflations, construction costs, efficiency standards, and how we can actually position the corporations to finance the anticipated retrofits. Now, just something to note that's important is that unfortunately, just 18% of Ontario Condo Reserve Fund studies between 2018 and 2022 explicitly considered high performance elements or carbon reduction, meaning there is not high consideration for the retrofit components. And also, boards are often unaware that a 12.5% owner petition can actually trigger an enhanced reserve fund study, which would allow an in-depth planning for retrofits. And as I have mentioned, unfortunately, this tool is rarely utilized in practice due to the lack of education and engagement that is provided. Where is the hidden potential in Ontario's framework? As I have mentioned, Ontario's framework has a lot of untapped potential. Engineers can sometimes reclassify upgrade. What does that mean? So if you recall earlier, I mentioned there is a distinction being between a repair and maintenance and also between an actual improvement. So if a proposed change is necessary to meet current building codes, safety standards, or maybe an industry standard as well, it may be deemed as repair, even where the performance is actually improving. So for example, if the replacement of old lights is coming in for LEDs, that may qualify as maintenance if that old technology is considered to be no longer relevant in comparable residential settings. But of course, coming up with that conclusion can actually be really significant as per my conversation with the Ontario Condos lawyers. Also, another example can be water technology coming up. The new water technology, how relevant can this be? That's also a major discussion that can happen, and in order to classify it, whether that's going to be a repair and maintenance versus an improvement. Also, in addition to that, there are some unproclaimed clauses as well that are important to consider, like the 97.5D. So that's something that was unproclaimed since 2015 that could actually let boards approve sustainability projects without a full owner vote. And if this clause is actually proclaimed, then this could instantly make Ontario really one of Canada's most enabling provinces in that sector. So really the message here, or the goal that I think we should focus on, is that we don't need to reinvent the law per se, but we need to activate what's actually there and what is currently available. So what the data actually shows, I think the numbers really tell important stories that only 15% of major retrofit proposals in Ontario actually get implemented. Meanwhile, similar projects in BC and Nova Scotia have a 35 to 40%, which can be almost double. And majority of the Ontario projects do not proceed just because of those challenges when it comes to the legal barriers rather than technical. There's of course financial component, but most of them are coming in because of those voting and legal barriers for consideration. All right, so now let's take a helicopter view and start looking at more Canada-wide across the provinces. So when we're comparing the provinces, we see a clear spectrum. So at the enabling end, definitely we see that BC has more flexible rules. For example, the majority approval is possible if a retrofit is in the depreciation report and is pre-funded. There is actually a special voting relief for EV infrastructure projects. And just for reference, in BC, they refer to them as contingency reserve funds or the CRFs. As I have noted, Ontario unfortunately has major restrictions. As I have noted, one of them is about the project cost. If it's costing more than 10% of the annual budget, it will require approval from 2/3 of the owners, not just those attending the annual general meeting, which is unfortunately a challenge, especially given the low attendance in those meetings. The reason as well for the low attendance, as per my conversation with the condo lawyers in Ontario, is that a lot of the residents and the owners are actually not living in those buildings. They're actually outside the country. So that's also just another barrier about having them involved in those conversations and getting their votes in. Now, of course, look at other provinces. They do have their own unique challenges. For example, Alberta has a flat 75% requirement for those substantial changes. Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they require 80% written consent. And also these thresholds combined with some ambiguous reserve fund regulations can actually create what one lawyer called as death by governance for many retrofit proposals, unfortunately. But looking at the bright side, so sort of shifting, looking at Nova Scotia. So despite them having the 80% voting requirements for any improvements that exceed 25% of the appraised value, it has seen owner turnout that exceeds 70% for some retrofit votes and even achieved 92% approval for a $200,000 EV infrastructure project, which is quite fascinating because they're able to get the 92% approval from a building for a significantly large project. And similarly, Alberta, although they have the 75% requirement, they have some flexibility in their act. For example, Section 38, which would allow reserve fund withdrawals without vote if project is a replacement with current standards, and B, if it's required to meet new building / health codes, and also if it's explicitly in the reserve funds. Let's look here at some of the outcomes that were identified through the interviews with the lawyers, engineers, designers, and property managers across Canada, which revealed some consistent themes about what enables or prevents the successful deep energy retrofits. For example, in Ontario, there was a discussion with a Condos lawyer who mentioned that the problem isn't that owners vote, it's that we can't get enough owners to vote at all. And that is a barrier itself. There was also Daniel, who's a building designer, who described that retrofit votes are practically unfeasible in large condos in Ontario. When look at Nova Scotia, the condos lawyer mentioned that owner education changes everything. They have noted how early engagement and owner education actually led to that 92% approval for their infrastructure projects. In Saskatchewan, also the property lawyer mentioned that flexibility in the bylaws is what actually equals that progress. So certainly we see here that there's a pattern about how the legal text actually matters, but also the human engagement matters just as much, which is very important to consider. Now, the barriers documented in Ontario and across Canada affects, as I have mentioned, millions of condo residents nationwide. And addressing those challenges would represent a significant opportunity in Canada's climate strategy. So why should this matter beyond Ontario? So if we align our frameworks, we could double the number of retrofit projects completed. Those certainly like national alignment on the policy frameworks could increase the retrofit completion rates from 15 to 20% to 35 to 40%, which would match the success seen in leading provinces. Also, it would certainly cut some delays that are currently happening in half. So having more streamlined voting thresholds, clear funding guidelines could certainly reduce the project timelines, as well as it can unlock a lot of energy savings, as well as create jobs in the market, which is very important. We talked a lot about what's happening in Ontario, what's happening outside of Ontario. What are some reforms that we can recommend more holistically nationwide? First, certainly it's the like for like requirement that could be eliminated or removed so that boards can upgrade to higher performance systems instead of replacing them with outdated equivalents. So encouraging the upgrades to higher performance systems. Second would be certainly lowering the approval thresholds, ideally tying the approval thresholds to the number of attendees at meetings rather than total ownership, as there are sometimes owners that are not heavily involved in the process. And third, building the education into the process where owners and boards need to see the long-term cost savings and comfort benefits of those retrofit projects. Provinces like Nova Scotia, BC really show that when the rules are clear, participation from the board is higher, the retrofit success rates can definitely increase and project timelines can be cut in half. With that right legal framework, Ontario and other provinces can certainly unlock the major carbon, cost, and resilience benefits that would benefit their condo communities. There are also other findings that are important to consider in terms of the recommendations. One of them is actually unifying definitions because, like, for example, energy upgrades count as repairs. I think that's really helpful instead of counting as improvement. So having that modification is very useful. Also, definitions of common areas. So there's ambiguity on whether windows or HVAC are common property to your unit. Also mandating the inclusion of decarbonization planning in the reserve fund studies with minimum scenario requirements and greenhouse gas reduction modeling is also an important tool. And also creating a specialized green retrofit charter system where to allow the condos to opt in to lower the thresholds for board approvals. That could be also a helpful strategy to promote retrofits. And of course, one of them to emphasize is in terms of the educational opportunities for the condo owners and boards. But those reforms, they would directly impact Canada's 2030 emissions reductions plan and achieving the net zero 2050 commitments, where deep retrofits in condos could reduce costs by 50% by 2040, which can translate to significant in dollars savings cumulatively by then. And they can also reduce the building sector emissions by up to 60% and create million skilled jobs from engineers to installers, designers to managers, and certainly that every retrofit that we are delaying that could keep that potential locked away. So this is certainly a climate solution, but also an economic benefit for Canada. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention. I hope this presentation highlighted that the biggest climate wins may sometimes not come from the new technologies, but rather from fixing the rules that govern it. And I would also like to thank Sustainable Buildings Canada and all the experts, the lawyers who contributed their insights to the study. And I look forward to any questions you may have. I think we have about 13 minutes.
Yeah, that was great. There's a lot of busyness in the Q&A in the chat. And I have to confess, I was trying to read that and track what you were saying at the same time. I do have a couple of my own questions, but I think David Katz has got a really great one right off the top. This question of how to change the voting threshold is an interesting one to me. And it's not the first time that I've heard this, but as you pointed out, often it's the participation in the AGM that is the key problem. You might generally have broad support for it, but nobody participates in the AGM. Is anyone looking at even the structure of how you get to these decisions? Or as David's asking, how do we get the condo board members to see the merit of these deep retrofits? And Stephen Lee followed up with, what's the question that we should be asking decision makers to enable these kinds of changes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think so many times where the condo board members, because they're involved in that process really significantly, I think having some sort of mandatory training in terms of the deep energy retrofits and their importance. And I think that's something very important that was mentioned by one of the condo lawyers in Ontario. He mentioned very explicitly that there are so many times there are really great projects that do have a lot of financial impacts. I think being able to link the financial piece, the cost savings component into that conversation, it would be very important because there's always that gap. People think, okay, it's just going to be high investments, it's going to be higher monthly payments. What is it going to translate? So actually doing all of those HVAC improvements, doing improved building envelopes, that all would translate in terms of improvement on the cost. So having those considerations, I think, is very important to ensure that we're having a full picture in terms of how that's going to translate into long-term cost savings. So I think also having that training component. I know you mentioned there are some training courses that are offered, but also having some mandatory trainings would be very
Yes. So just to clarify, mandatory training for condo boards, is that what you're saying? Have you seen that done in other places?
It was not something that came to my attention that it was mandatory. It was not, but there was more initiatives that are being conducted nationally that are promoting the educational piece more than Ontario. Specifically in BC, there is so much work that's being done in terms of promoting the retrofit education for condo board members, but it's not mandated per se.
Okay. And I'm quite interested in this like for like idea. For me, I hadn't been thinking about it as a restriction per se, but just an old habit. A little bit like how people confuse building codes as the standard. Meanwhile, those of us who've worked with building codes know it's a baseline. And so I'm interested in getting clarification of, is it actually restrictive or is it pointing to people in a lower than they could actually be thinking direction? And maybe it would take just some rewording.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think just given the nature of that information in terms of like for like and the expectation this would mean that actually doing the repair and maintenance, that would be something according to the original standards or to the original standards of the construction. I know that there are certainly other clauses or phrases that would clarify that and compare it to understand the repair and maintenance versus actually improvements that are being done to the condos. But unfortunately, I think there is a huge misunderstanding to understand how we can actually conduct or actually do the improvements while also acknowledging the like for like. There's so many times that when the condo boards actually read the like for like, oh no, we don't want to get into that whole voting process. And sometimes a lot of those ideas or also those proposals, they do not go through just because of that hesitancy from the language that's being presented. So I think lightening that language to promote the retrofits would be really useful. Certainly, there should be some components of the like for like being translated or being incorporated, but I think the way that's currently phrased, unfortunately, it's leading a lot of people to go away from the retrofits in Ontario.
Yeah. A lot of people are bringing up the high cost. I wonder if you can touch a little bit more on reserve funds and if you're seeing changes in how people are doing reserve fund planning. And I was quite interested in this idea that engineers could direct the owners through a reclassification. It actually made me a little nervous about, is it perceived as manipulative? And then could it develop a trust issue within the sector?
Yeah, for sure. When it comes to the engineer classification, actually, that's not very easy to get signed off. It's not very easy to say, oh, that's just going to be a repair. I'm going to be installing a really fancy HVAC system that's just simply going to be considered to be a repair. There are certainly some restrictions. There are also people who can negotiate back, particularly the owners who do not want to get involved in the whole additional payment process. That's usually something that is being triggered for sure, is that understanding the engineer reclassification. But this is something to be considered. I think what is even more interesting is that the section 97.5, the one that I mentioned, which would mention that which is being unproclaimed, that provision would actually exempt those green upgrades from owner voting requirements. I think there should still be the owner voting piece, but I think there should be more redefining in terms of who's involved in this voting. I think having inactive participants, inactive owners getting involved in those conversations can certainly lead to so many obstructions. So making sure that we're able to get the ones who are actively involved, who are the ones who attend meetings rather than just the entire ownership, would be particularly useful, similar to what's being done for the cost that's between 1 to 10%. As I have shared, there were three different categories. There was less than 1%, 1 to 10%, and greater to 10%. The ones that are less than 1% will not have any notice for owners. 1 to 10% is the one where you look at the majority of the owners that attend the meeting.
Yeah. There are several comments. I'm ignoring all the upvoting, unfortunately, but there are several comments really relating to stakeholder engagement, even some questions around how we look at it, maybe focusing less on the majority and more about, is there an over-reliance on AGM? Bruce McCullough has suggested that to get that kind of work done, it's going door to door to gain that support. And then just above that question, David Wilson's brought up an interesting point. Maybe it's the way that we qualify a vote. He's saying, just like proxy votes, shouldn't the result depend on the number of owner votes cast, not the number of total voters? If there is broad support, they're the ones who came to the AGM. So then those numbers are the ones. Some comments on how we're evaluating that owner support and how we're getting that support.
Absolutely, absolutely. Correct. To get total ownership. And about that point, that's going door to door to actually get the vote. That was something that was mentioned by a Condos lawyer. He literally mentioned, as part of one of their projects on one of the proposals, they had to go door to door to start getting votes in because their people were so much inactive, getting not so much support, unfortunately, because of that lack of education piece. So I think there should be some sort of way in order to connect the knowledge between the owners, the board members, making sure that this is being considered. But even then, there will be, of course, some owners that don't want to be involved in these conversations. So I think making sure that having the ones involved have a great voice in the evaluation process is very important. Actually, one of the cases in Saskatchewan, the condo lawyer at that time, Mark Kelly, he mentioned very clearly that even for them to have an EV charging station to promote in the parking lot of the building, they actually also needed to go through the whole voting process because they had to identify there's that additional cost component, how they can actually allocate that cost component to all the residents in the building. So then for us to make it so much easier, they literally had to consider this not as a common element, but rather as a unit space for it to be considered for one of the unit owners. It became that challenging. So they don't want to get involved in that whole ownership evaluation process, but rather trying to quantify how much that cost would involve the retrofit process and tagging that for one of the owners. So I think that was one of the most significant challenges, is being able to have extra awareness for the owners as well as for the board members to promote the retrofit.
I'm going to look at one more question because we do have to bolt, but Elizabeth Glore-Bell has an interesting question. Could the frame be reduce red tape that obstructs condo boards from thriving, which matches at least Ontario's kind of framing? I know Alberta is quite focused on this red tape puzzle. Have you seen some messaging that really resonates with decision makers and maybe policymakers?
Yeah. Do you mean like some lessons that do resonate?
But it's the messaging around, we need these changes. It's not about forcing condos to go into some green agenda if that feels charged, but more about condo owners being able to reduce red tape from having better living experiences in their homes.
Absolutely. The benefits of those retrofits, it's not really just in terms of cost savings. It's not really about the idea of just going greener, but also understanding that this can lead to actually well-being and indoor environment, looking more air quality component, looking at the indoor environment in terms of mold growth, all of those pieces. It's certainly to be important to retrofit concepts in order to be sure that we're having better indoor air quality and indoor environment for the residents for sure.
So good. Okay. There's so many questions in here that are unanswered. I'm going to have to encourage everybody to reach out directly. Bryn is easy to find. And I imagine, Yazan, I think that you shared your information on your slides. And this, as I mentioned, is recorded and will be posted. Thanks, everybody. Great questions, great turnout. Just want to mention that our next event is actually next Tuesday. I'll also be hosting, hopefully a little smoother with my Zoom that morning, 2 hours, talking to our deep retrofit accelerators, as well as a couple of international examples. Take a look at our events page and sign up for newsletters to get some updates on that. All right. Thanks, Imran and Lindsay, for helping me through this. Thanks, Bryn and Yazan, and everybody have a great Thanksgiving weekend.
Thanks, Betsy.
So much.